But Here, There and Everywhere was one of my songs on it. And but John sort of, just when it finishes.
He's been called the mastermind, the martyr, even the man who broke up the Beatles. But at 82, Paul McCartney is no longer interested in defending his place in the story. He's rewriting the tone of it altogether. For decades, fans obsessed over who ended the band. Yoko, ego, lawsuits. But McCartney's recent reflections reveal something deeper. Not a clean break, but a slow unraveling, weighed down by fear, loss, and silence. Through interviews and podcasts, he's started to dismantle the myth with quiet honesty, not just about the music, but about the emotional debris left behind. A missed goodbye, a misread decision, a truth withheld for too long. This isn't nostalgia, it's reckoning. And buried inside his words is a single turning point. Overlooked, misunderstood, that changes how we see the Beatles fall. If you think you already know how it ended, you might want to listen again. Closely. Yoko Ono's role reexamined. For decades, one name sat at the center of the blame for the Beatles' breakup: Yoko Ono. To fans, and even some critics, she was seen as the disruptive outsider, the woman who inserted herself into the band's inner sanctum and drove a wedge between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The idea was simple, convenient, and persisted across generations: that Yoko's constant presence in the studio, especially during the recording of the White Album, shattered the fragile balance within the group. But now, Paul McCartney, at 82, has finally challenged that long-standing narrative. In a candid moment on his podcast, Life in Lyrics, McCartney spoke with a tone that mixed reflection and regret. He admitted that Yoko had every right to be there, adding that if John wanted her there, then that was John's decision. This acknowledgement marks a significant departure from his past frustrations. While he once saw her presence as interference, he now recognizes that dismissing her was more about internal band tensions than anything she did intentionally. His new perspective reframes Yoko not as a villain, but as a symbol of change the Beatles were unprepared to accept. Does this mean that Yoko was really the reason the world-famous band broke up? Or does it just provide a point for the more serious issues? This new inference by McCartney seems to lean on the side of the second inference. It has also simplified things in blaming Yoko so that the public, and even maybe the band members themselves, did not have to deal with the more complicated realities. The band was evolving, fragmentation, outgrowing its identity. It is easier to blame Yoko than to face that once a unified creative force, the Beatles had begun to move in different directions before she entered their lives. This also puts under the microscope how much public opinion has been shaped by gender and racial biases. Yoko, an avant-garde Japanese artist and a woman in a male-dominated space, became a scapegoat for a story that was never so black and white. Paul found the courage to speak out about things more openly at a ripe old age, which does not, however, wipe the slate clean for all Yoko's suffering with the world outside. It just opens a door to attenuation on the rewriting of that chapter of Beatles history. The myth may have served a number of purposes for the grieving fan base, but McCartney's words would have challenged all of us to move beyond easy narratives and look at the fuller truth. Behind the headlines and finger-pointing, something far more personal was quietly unraveling from the inside. The real breaking points. By the end of the 1960s, the Beatles were no longer the tightly knit band that had conquered the world together. Each member had grown into a distinct creative force, with diverging musical goals, and the unity that once defined the group began to fracture. John Lennon was increasingly drawn to experimental and conceptual art, heavily influenced by his partnership with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney, on the other hand, remained rooted in structured, melodic pop compositions. This fundamental difference in artistic vision began to erode the collaborative spirit that had once been the band's foundation. George Harrison, too, was evolving rapidly as a songwriter and musician, producing material that many felt rivaled Lennon and McCartney's output. However, his contributions were often sidelined, leaving him feeling undervalued and creatively stifled. Harrison's frustration, though less publicized at the time, played a critical role in the group's growing dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, Ringo Starr, though less vocal, found himself caught in the middle of increasingly polarized creative debates, trying to maintain balance in a band drifting further apart. These different paths were not just about musical preferences, they spoke of more profound changes within the person. By the years of 1968 and 1966, Beatles had actually transformed into 4 solo artists working under one name. The atmosphere in the studio had become quite tense. Communication would break down completely, and collaboration would give way to solo efforts. McCartney has said that by that time, the chemistry was soured, in that fun and spontaneity gave way to escalating tensions and struggles for control. Looking back, McCartney's thoughts suggest that no single person or moment could be blamed for the breakup, for it was the end result of many years of personal and creative drift. Each Beatle found that growing artistically and personally might mean relinquishing the holding together of the 4. So, then, this did not become a story of betrayal or intervention, it became one of inexorable development. McCartney no longer talks about outside factors. Instead, he dwells on the insatiable dynamics that rendered it almost impossible for the Beatles to stay together. Brian Epstein's death. The death of Brian Epstein in August 1967 marked a seismic shift in the Beatles' internal dynamics. As the band's longtime manager and de facto authority figure, Epstein had played a crucial role in mediating conflicts and providing a structure that kept the group focused. His passing left a void not just in terms of business leadership, but in emotional grounding. For a band that had transitioned from scrappy Liverpool musicians to global icons under his guidance, losing Epstein was akin to losing their compass. In the wake of Epstein's death, Paul McCartney attempted to step into the leadership vacuum. He began organizing projects like Magical Mystery Tour and pushing the band toward new goals, hoping to keep their momentum alive. However, this shift was not universally welcomed. John Lennon, already drifting creatively and emotionally from the group, resisted what he saw as Paul's increasing control. George Harrison, too, chafed at McCartney's direction, particularly as his own songwriting ambitions grew. What may have seemed like McCartney trying to steer the band forward was viewed by others as overreach. This phase illuminated how fragile the equilibrium within the group was. Epstein had been the buffer, managing logistical arrangements, keeping them from external pressures, and mediating minor internal disagreements before they became destructive. With him gone, small disagreements would fester into crises, and personal egos would clash ever more often, while amalgamating views turned even harder. The Beatles now had to hold each other accountable, oftentimes without the emotional tools or indifference that Epstein had provided. With much communication falling now on deaf ears, the absence of a white knight or trusted leader easily spelled the death knell for the working machinery of the group. This sentiment was relayed by McCartney, who later recalled how destabilizing Epstein's death was. Although trying to preserve the legacy of the Beatles, he felt that his attempts to take the reins may have sped up the disintegration of the band. In a band that was totally communal, they hardly fought their way into a definition of themselves in the empty world without Epstein. What remained were 4 increasingly insecure men in setting their collective future. The big structure, which had held them together for all these years, collapsed without a manager. The Alen Klein dispute and the legal divide. By 1969, the Beatles found themselves not only divided creatively, but also deeply fractured over business decisions. One of the most significant and ultimately irreparable splits came over the issue of band management. After the death of Brian Epstein, the group needed someone to handle their increasingly complex finances and contracts. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr favored American businessman Alen Klein, who had previously worked with the Rolling Stones. Paul McCartney, however, strongly opposed this choice, advocating instead for his future in-laws, Lee and John Eastman, to manage the band's affairs. McCartney's refusal to accept Klein wasn't just about business preferences, it reflected a fundamental mistrust. He questioned Klein's intentions and was concerned about handing over control of the Beatles' empire to someone he felt hadn't earned their trust. In contrast, the others were swayed by Klein's promises to improve their financial standing. This split in loyalty led to McCartney feeling increasingly isolated, both personally and professionally. What had once been a creative brotherhood was now entangled in power struggles and corporate negotiations, with emotions running high on both sides. The decisive moment came rather late in 1970, when McCartney made the drastic move of suing the other three Beatles. His intention to disband their business partnership and cease any further mismanagement of funds surprised his fans and looked to many as a betrayal. This became the story of Paul McCartney breaking up the Beatles for years to come. In truth, it was only a last throw to save as much legacy and money as possible for the abandon effort, emphasized by Paul in later interviews. This legal battle marked a sea change in the terrain of the band's arguments. Creative differences had taken a back seat to legal paperwork and public court battles. McCartney's doing what seemed right for the Beatles had an unfortunate cost to his reputation, at least for a while. A little retrospective reveals that the rift regarding Alen Klein lay more in trust, control, and a band that had grown larger than the systems that once contained it, rather than money. Finally, the business of being the Beatles overshadowed the bond that made the Beatles what they were. The truth behind the first departure. In a twist of irony, the public face of the Beatles' breakup was not the first to walk away. While many fans associate Paul McCartney's 1970 press release with the band's dissolution, it was actually John Lennon who made the first decisive move months earlier. In September 1969, during a private meeting, Lennon informed the others that he was leaving the band. This revelation was not immediately shared with the public, largely at the urging of their new manager, Alen Klein, who feared that a formal breakup announcement could jeopardize ongoing business deals. This silence placed McCartney in a difficult and increasingly uncomfortable position. When he later chose to reveal in April 1970 that he was no longer working with the Beatles, it was interpreted as the official breakup, and worse, as his doing. McCartney found himself painted as the instigator, the one who abandoned the band, even though he was, in truth, the one reacting to Lennon's earlier decision. Over time, this misperception hardened into myth, creating a lasting wound in McCartney's relationship with the public, and even among some fans. McCartney has since opened up about the emotional draw of what it feels like being cast unfairly as the villain in the breakup drama. He expressed irritation about the media portrayal as well as the inability of his bandmates to speak up, leaving everything to the media to stick. McCartney, in interviews decades later, would reveal that he felt betrayed and misunderstood, perhaps considering the fact that he had been extremely loyal during all the rough last years of the group. His decision to go public with the reason was, according to him, a reaction to Lennon's leaving, and also an effort to regain some feeling of truth in a situation shrouded in spin. It casts an entirely different light on events at the Beatles' end. Rather than damaging McCartney's reputation with ego or Yoko Ono influence, it causes them to say that by then, in 1969, The condition of each Beatle was fundamentally at an individual and creative breaking point. Lennon's exit was not a shocker to the band. They were already wrestling with that reality. What is indeed surprising at this point is the action of how long it took for that truth to come forth, publicly. McCartney's reflections now compel us to reconsider, not just how the Beatles ended, but who had the first say in shaping the tale of that end. What followed Lennon's quiet goodbye wasn't just a breakup. It triggered a private unraveling that McCartney kept hidden for years. McCartney's post-Beatles depression. In the immediate aftermath of the Beatles' breakup, Paul McCartney faced a personal and emotional crisis that he rarely spoke about at the time. Unlike the energetic, confident public figure fans had grown to know, McCartney withdrew from the spotlight, retreating to his farm in Scotland. The loss of the Beatles, creatively, personally, and symbolically, hit him harder than many realized. He later admitted that he turned to alcohol during this period, struggling with depression and a deep sense of purposelessness. For someone whose adult life had been defined by the band, its sudden end left a vacuum that was as emotional as it was artistic. Without the structure of the Beatles, and amid mounting public criticism, McCartney questioned not only his future in music, but his identity altogether. In various interviews years later, he spoke candidly about how low he had sunk, sometimes unable to get out of bed, often unsure if he had the motivation or confidence to start over. He felt isolated, vilified, and creatively paralyzed. For an artist so associated with optimism and melodic brilliance, this period was a stark reminder that fame offered no immunity from emotional collapse. Linda McCartney, who was not only Paul McCartney's widow, but also a partner for life, helped him come through the dark phase of his life. The emotional and artistic encouragement of her got built into a gradual recovery for him. She encouraged him to write and return to music where he has always been very much. With that, Paul started to create again to form wings. This was a new chapter in him edition while providing another light for his career to reclaim the identity as a musician out of the shadow of the Beatles. Songs were written like Maybe I'm Amazed, which spoke not just for personal struggle, but also for love that carried him forward. Even with such rebirth, scars from those times never completely healed, McCartney would admit. The Beatles were much more than a band of family, a creative ecosystem and a worldwide phenomenon. With their collapse, not just ended a group, but unraveled one defining chapter of his life. The emotional fallout of such loss marked career trajectories in the future for McCartney, his relationship with women, and a guarded relationship with fame. Much of it narrates tough paths through grief, depression, and rediscovery, while reinforcing that behind the legend was a man who, just like you, had to find a way to keep going when everything familiar had fallen away. Beyond the partnership, a brotherhood lost. Long before they were bandmates, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were friends, two teenagers bonded by music, loss, and ambition. Their partnership was the core of the Beatles' genius, producing some of the most iconic songs in history. But beneath the melodies was a profound emotional connection, one that made the eventual separation all the more painful. In recent years, McCartney has openly admitted that much of his resentment toward Yoko Ono during the band's final days stemmed not only from creative friction, but from something deeper: fear of losing John. The shift in Lennon's priorities toward Yoko, toward experimental art, and eventually toward a solo path, left McCartney feeling abandoned, even if he couldn't fully express it at the time. While the world watched a musical empire unravel, McCartney was quietly mourning the end of a personal and creative relationship that had defined his life. He has since said that the breakup wasn't just about business or artistic direction. It was about letting go of someone he saw as a brother. That emotional rupture lingered long after the final recording session. There would never be any true reunion or reconciliation. In 1980, John Lennon was murdered before his New York apartment, an event that sent shockwaves across the globe and left McCartney devastated. He later described feeling robbed of a final conversation, of the chance to reconnect beyond the tensions of their final years as Beatles. Though they maintained some contact post-breakup, McCartney has acknowledged that many things were left unsaid. The unresolved nature of their relationship only deepened the grief, leaving a wound he still carries today. Revealing his public persona in the course of time in interviews with McCartney, he has allowed bits of personal loss to surface. His dedications to Lennon, songs like Here Today, speak to a man still coming to terms with the absence of someone who once felt like family. At 82, McCartney reflects not only on the memories, but also on the fact that this man has been robbed of from time to come to share his plight with that milestone regarding loss, vulnerability, and emotional devaluation of greatness in itself. The legacy of the partnership of Lennon-McCartney may have altered music, but at its heart, it was also a losing bond, a very fragile human relationship that was to become a significant aspect of each man's life beyond fame. Public perception versus private pain. When the Beatles finally came to an end, it wasn't just the band that fractured, it was Paul McCartney's public image. Despite not being the first to walk away, McCartney was widely portrayed as the one who broke up the Beatles. His decision to announce his departure in April 1970, intended partly as a response to Lennon's earlier but unpublicized exit, placed him squarely in the crosshairs of public blame. Fans and media alike cast him as the villain, the one who walked away from something sacred. McCartney has since reflected on this, calling the backlash hurtful and admitting that the weight of that misperception isolated him deeply. What made it worse for McCartney was the silence from his bandmates. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr did little at the time to correct the public narrative, allowing the idea that Paul had shattered the Beatles to persist. In interviews years later, McCartney expressed that he felt abandoned, not just by the fans, but by those he had spent over a decade creating history with. The lack of public support from within the band during that pivotal moment left McCartney alone to bear the emotional and reputational burden of a decision that wasn't truly his alone. The evaluation definitely determined how McCartney appropriated himself with celebrity in the years that followed. Unlike the smiling, optimistic Beatle image, he became more guarded, more careful with things said publicly. That image of him as overly controlling or self-serving stuck for years, despite his every effort to explain the entire picture. For many years, his self-adolescence and work with Wings helped him assert his musical identity, while this perception of him as master breakup architect remained difficult to shake. This stood in dark contrast to the otherwise redolent zeniths of that much-worshipped man, Lennon, especially post his disintegration. With time, as more details emerged, and McCartney opened up about the various complexities surrounding the end of the band, public perception began to shift. But the memories of the times still cling bitterly in his reflections. The Beatles' disbandment was not merely a loss of band for McCartney, it was an emotional unwinding, exaggerated by a world choosing to see him as the one who switched off the party lights. But what his later admissions reveal is not only frustration, but also a long-held desire to overturn a narrative that for so long had ignored the emotional nuance and internal dynamics that really caused the band to disband. Over the years, McCartney has acknowledged that this long-held public mischaracterization didn't just bruise his reputation, it altered his sense of trust. Being cast as the villain in the Beatles' breakup made him hyper-aware of how narratives are shaped and how quickly public affection can turn. It hardened his approach to fame, made him wary of the press, and even shaped how he presented himself in future projects. The cheerful Beatle gave way to someone more strategic, more guarded. For McCartney, the fallout wasn't only emotional, it was reputational armor that would take decades to shed. Revisiting the myth in later years. In the years following the Beatles' breakup, Paul McCartney often spoke defensively when asked about the band's collapse. For decades, he appeared to carry the weight of public blame and personal frustration, particularly around how history had cast him. But recent interviews and podcast appearances, such as Life in Lyrics, reveal a McCartney who has softened, one who is now willing to see the breakup not as a betrayal, but as a necessary transformation. This shift in tone marks a significant evolution in how McCartney views not only the end of the Beatles, but also his own role in that story. Rather than assigning blame, McCartney now frames the Beatles' dissolution as part of a natural progression. The band had grown, and so had its members. Their personal and artistic ambitions began to stretch in different directions, and staying together might have meant suppressing those individual identities. In this light, McCartney no longer seems to view the split with bitterness. Instead, he acknowledges that the breakup was perhaps inevitable, that even the most iconic creative partnerships must eventually come to an end when they outgrow their original form. However, it even goes so far in reflective tone to almost all people he seemed to have earlier resented. McCartney has, on occasions, talked well about Yoko Ono. He has said he initially kept her away from the studio as it was for his own worry, with respect to the feeling that he may lose John, rather than anything she might have done. Similarly, he has fondly spoken of Lennon, notwithstanding the distance that marked their last years together. They are revisions, and not an archiving of time. This is retrospective in opening up such dimensions and complexities from blame to understanding. What strikes the observer about McCartney's reflections in late life is not only emotional maturity but a certain release as well. The grudges and guardedness that once defined his post-Beatles narrative have given way to empathetic understanding for his bandmates, his wife, willing to be, and himself. He invites fans to consider the end of the Beatles as a narrative of growth, rather than rupture, with this quiet but powerful gesture that brings not only him, but everyone who has suffered under the weight of a busted legend together. This evolution in tone also highlights McCartney's growing desire to free himself from the burden of legacy management. For years, it seemed like he was fighting two battles, one to preserve the Beatles' history and another to protect his own place within it. But now, he's allowing contradictions to stand. He admits he didn't always get it right, that he misread moments, that pride sometimes clouded connection. These aren't confessions designed to win sympathy. They are acknowledgments from someone finally willing to let the past breathe. In doing so, McCartney offers something few public figures ever do, an invitation to revise our understanding without asking us to erase what we once believed. What's most powerful is that McCartney no longer sounds like he's trying to prove anything. Instead, he speaks like someone who has accepted that truth, and memory rarely align neatly. His reflections don't rewrite the past. They complicate it, humanize it, and make it richer. As McCartney sheds old narratives, what emerges isn't just clarity. It's a quieter, deeper legacy that few expected. What McCartney's reflection reveals about growth. At 82, Paul McCartney is no longer trying to win arguments about the Beatles' breakup. He's trying to understand it. His recent reflections, whether in interviews, documentaries, or podcasts, show a striking evolution from a man once focused on defending his role to one now driven by a desire to contextualize the band's story with empathy and depth. This shift doesn't just reflect maturity. It reveals a quiet courage in revisiting old wounds, re-examining long-held beliefs, and letting go of the narratives that once served as emotional armor. In acknowledging that the Beatles' end was not the fault of one person or one moment, McCartney reframes the breakup as a deeply human story. It wasn't just a band falling apart, it was four men growing up, growing apart, and navigating enormous personal and creative changes under an unforgiving global spotlight. Rather than casting it as a scandal or a tragedy, McCartney now sees it as an evolution. That reframing invites fans to stop asking, "Who caused the breakup?" and instead ask, "What did it teach us?" It's a move from blame to insight, from myth to meaning. It also permits the vulnerable sides of McCartney to come out, a thing he had avoided doing all along. Admitting to post-breakup depression, fears of losing Lennon, and early wrong judgments against figures like Yoko Ono reflect a man who is finally at peace with the complexities of his past. One does not have to be the sensible one, or by and large, the melodic genius keeping it together anymore. He is just Paul. Just a man who lived through the rise and fall of the most famous band in history, and came out the other side trying to make sense of it all. So loud above all is this humility for revisionist defense. These are likely to be McCartney's last and most consequential reflections on Beatles history. Beyond the music and the legacy, he has something difficult to come by in the world of mythical fame: honesty. By trading uncertainty for nuance, by admitting pain as much as brilliance, he helps fans to see the Beatles not only as icons, but as people. As the band's music could teach the world to dream, McCartney's late-life dispassion may be teaching us all how to let go with understanding, not judgment. This new outlook also reveals something telling about how McCartney now defines legacy. It's no longer just about the music or the milestones. It's about the emotional honesty he leaves behind. In recent years, he's begun speaking less like a performer and more like a witness, someone who lived through something extraordinary and who now feels compelled to strip away the polish and show the rust beneath. That shift from myth to memory isn't just brave, it's rare. In a world where legends often cling to the spotlight, McCartney seems more interested in leaving behind something real than something perfect. What's perhaps most surprising is that this late-life vulnerability doesn't diminish his image. It deepens it. Fans aren't seeing a fallen hero. They're seeing a fuller one. A man who once symbolized pop perfection is now embracing contradiction, complexity, and even regret. And in doing so, McCartney doesn't just reframe the Beatles' ending. He reframes what it means to grow old in public, with grace. If this gave you a new way to see things, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps more people find these kinds of stories. And if you're into exploring moments that changed music forever, check out the similar video on screen now.